Hello and welcome. Today we're going to visit the African Studies Association's annual meeting and learn what we can from what they're discussing about African history, American history, and in fact, the use of some new digital technologies. The African Studies Association is holding its meetings in a virtual form this year because we're all in COVID lockdown. It is going to focus for a large part of its deliberations on the whole question of COVID-19 and how it's affecting Africa, how it's affecting our learning about Africa, and how we're each going to have to face in every country new kinds of social circumstances, political circumstances, economic circumstances, and a good deal of hardship. The African Studies Association has been organized for decades, and it's been publishing material of help not only for those interested in doing research in Africa, but those wanting to teach about it as well. You ought to consider becoming a member. There are a lot of advantages to doing so. In the annual meeting, they have several days of materials, including Thursday, Friday, and Saturday sessions online that were very rich this year. One of the sessions was toward the very end on Saturday at 8 p.m. until 9:45 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And it looked particularly at the online research and teaching that can take place with African maps. It provided some tips, techniques, and examples, as well as some resources for teachers to use. In fact, you can scan in the QR code and find out a bit of what they were up to. The QR code will provide more information for you on your cell phone and a lot of links for you to follow. So scan in the code and follow the links that are provided there. Scanning in the QR code will take you to these PDF slides, among other things. These slides can be used in a variety of contexts, and they can be used as a launchpad for research. The slides provide a step-by-step video guide to accessing historical maps of Africa for research and teaching. But first, why should we care about maps anyway? What good are they? Especially printed ones, and especially old printed maps. You have to ask, what good are they? Isn't Google Maps all we need at this point? You can instantly update a map of any place in the world with the latest data. Why bother with old maps? We all know that old maps are inaccurate anyway, so who needs them? Well, as it turns out, there are lots of reasons to learn to read and study old maps. For one thing, they provide us with a glimpse of the worldview of previous people and times in history. Beyond that, they allow us to engage in a refreshing manner in comparative history from a variety of new perspectives. So there's nothing really old about old maps. It's the perspectives you bring to them that make them, in fact, quite new. Consider, for example, the realm of colonial history. We all know something about colonial history because we're taught it in school early on. And in fact, it's so boring for many people to look at, but there are ways that we can learn a lot more from different perspectives. And maps invite us to look at things from a different perspective. So let's have a look at commerce and cartography on colonial frontiers, re-examining American and African history through maps. We've all learned a lot about American colonial frontiers and trading with indigenous populations Certainly our founding father, George Washington, was himself an advanced party in a way with the surveying, mapping, and trading on the West Virginia frontier. One West Virginia native, Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr., has led our way into looking at other kinds of frontiers around the world, and he stimulated the study of African historical maps. Today, we're going to turn to consider commerce and cartography on colonial frontiers, re-examining American and African history through maps. There's been an important new initiative in the evolution of digital history. It's been supported and inspired by the United States National Archives. It began in large part with the objective of making the papers of the country's revolutionary founding fathers more accessible to scholars and to the public, both in America and the wider world. The results have been quite revolutionary, not just because they deal with the papers of the revolutionary founding fathers, but more because they're leading to a whole new set of perspectives in comparative colonial history. Comparative colonial history is relatively new, but it's an important new innovation in world history because we need more to understand the origins of our current circumstance. Consider, for example, a recent talk from the National Archives based in part on these newly accessible documents. The talk was presented by Colin Callaway, the author of The Indian World of George Washington, the First President, the First Americans, and the Birth of the Nation. It was introduced by the director of the National Archives. Let's have a listen.
The Indian World of George Washington, as Professor Callaway states in his book's introduction, shows how Native America shaped the life of the man who shaped the nation. We know a great deal about George Washington, or think we do. In school, we learned that he was our first president and commander of the American Army that won the Revolutionary War, but we sometimes see these two roles in isolation from the world Washington inhabited. In this world, territorial expansion was key to prosperity and growth. Washington, from his youthful days as a surveyor during his military career and on through his presidency, looked to the West for opportunities and encountered peoples who already inhabited those lands. In the National Archives, we hold 377 ratified Indian treaties, 3 of them from Washington's presidency. Across the mall, the National Museum of the American Indian has featured one of these treaties in its nation-to-nation exhibit for 6 months at a time. Through this partnership, millions of visitors over the last few years have been able to view these important documents. But as I said, there are more than 300 treaties. To open up access to all of these treaties, we are embarking on a new project to digitize all of them, plus their supporting documents. Future scholars, as well as tribal leaders and lawyers, will be able to examine them closely, not only for historical importance, but also for their relevance today. This project will open up our vaults to a worldwide audience, much as the digitization of the papers of the nation's founding fathers has made accessible the words written by George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and others. Founders Online is a wonderful portal to these papers gathered and annotated by dedicated teams of scholars, as Professor Callaway referred to the staff of the papers of George Washington in his acknowledgments. All of the separate papers projects represented in Founders Online have been supported by the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, the grant-making arm of the National Archives. Providing access to our records is our core mission. Because we preserve and make available these records, writers can put together the pieces of historical evidence to tell us stories of our past. Colin Callaway is John Kimball Jr., 1943 professor of history and professor of Native American Studies at Dartmouth College. He first arrived at Dartmouth as a visiting professor in 1990 and became a permanent member of the faculty in 1995. He received his PhD from the History of Leeds in England in 1978. After moving to the United States, he taught high school in Springfield, Vermont, served 2 years as associate director and editor of the Darcy McNichol Center for the History of American Indian at the Newberry Library in Chicago, and taught for 7 years at the University of Wyoming. Professor Callaway has written many books on Native American history, including The Scratch of a Pen, 1763 and the Transformation of North America, One Vast Winter Count, The Native American West Before Lewis and Clark, and 2 books for the Bedford series in History and Culture, Our Hearts Fell to the Ground, Plains Indian Views of How the West Was Lost, and The World Turned Upside Down, Indian Voices from Early America. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Colin Callaway.
Thank you, David. Thank you all for giving up your lunchtime and coming, although I'm not sure why you would on a day like this. Where I live in Vermont, 2 weeks ago, we still had snow on the ground. So if it wasn't for the fact that I was showing you images, I'd suggest we have class outside. I also should say I have a smart blue blazer if anyone feels uncomfortable, but if you don't, I'm much more comfortable without it. So the publisher has billed my book as a biography, which took me somewhat by surprise, because I never thought of it as that, even though it follows Washington's life as its narrative arc. My thinking behind this book was to basically use George Washington as a vehicle, if that doesn't sound sort of too crass, because as probably a European, when I look at American history, so much of American history makes no sense to me without the presence of Indian people. As a historian, so often reading American history, so much of it made no sense because there were no Indian people in that story. And a lot of us have been doing that kind of work. So the thinking here was to take perhaps the most famous American at the most critical point in the nation's creation and to demonstrate how important Native Americans were in that, or perhaps another way, to get lots and lots of people who read lots and lots of books about George Washington to read this book and find that they were actually reading about Native Americans. But perhaps not Native Americans as such, so much as about their importance and why they mattered in this story. And fundamental to that, of course, is an understanding that this is a country, this is a nation built on Indian land. Now, that's not a revisionist interpretation of American history. That's really just a fact. And it's not even my idea. I stole that idea from George Washington. He understood that. He said that quite clearly, or almost quite clearly. When I first was contemplating writing this book, I read lots of biographies of George Washington, most of which made minimal mention of Native Americans, but all of which talked at great length about Western land. Or if you simply cross out Western and put Indian, that's a whole different complexion on the thing. So this is a map from the Library of Congress, basically showing George Washington's lands. By the time he dies, he has about 45,000 acres of land. He's a famous or infamous speculator at a time when most, certainly men of wealth and elite status, were speculators. He recognized and identified Western/Indian land as the key to his personal fortune. And when he became president, he recognized it as a key to the future prosperity and power of the United States. And he made no qualms about that.
Well, that's a new perspective in American history. We haven't really absorbed the fact that much of America was defined prior to the Declaration of Independence. In fact, that whole history of diplomacy before the American Revolution is crucial now to understand because it's foundational in the myths that many settlers took forward with them after the Revolution.
Up until this point, the way that Native American diplomacy happened was through regular treaties in which alliances and partnerships and friendships were affirmed and reaffirmed. You didn't kind of just sign a treaty and keep it in practice for 50 years. You'd regularly renew it and refresh it. And one of the ways that you renewed and refreshed it was through ceremonial gift giving. So if we were allies, we might trade with you guns and ammunition to show that we trusted you as a friend and a trading partner, and you might trade goods for us that we want to then bring back to manufacture.
The articles of a treaty can be read in detail now thanks to the digitization of these early documents. This particular one occurred after the American War of Independence, but before we had a constitution. They're published in the Articles of a Treaty with the Shawnee Cherokee Nation, and they're possessed now by the Library of Congress, but made available through the digitization of these early documents. Many of the early documents carry with them prints and other maps that are published in atlases, like this one that came out in 1777 during the Revolutionary War, called the North American Atlas, selected from the most authentic maps, charts, plans, etc. by Faden Williams. Now in the possession of the Library of Congress, this is the kind of thing that can be digitized and now widely shared around the world. Looking at some of these early documents and maps, it's very instructive to look not only at the geography, but in the labeling of the map or the presentation of the cartouche, as they're called, these labels that indicate a kind of vignette of what was going on in the area at the time and between the principal actors. This is a good example of one. It's called a map of the most inhabited part of Virginia, containing the whole province of Maryland with part of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and North Carolina, drawn by Joshua Fry and Peter Jefferson in 1751. Well, it turns out this was just about the time that George Washington went to the western frontier beyond the Alleghenies and started to map the area, in part because he wanted to obtain future lands in the region. He was a surveyor and began to map things in order to lay out claims to existing land. It's very interesting for that reason that it's referred to as a map of the most inhabited part of Virginia. What they mean by that is the most inhabited part of Virginia inhabited by Europeans, shown here on the dock side, with, of course, their attendant labor force. In the skiffs over on the right, on the way out to the sailing ship, rolling barrels of produce of one kind or another. And over on the left, serving a drink as a domestic servant. Who knows what the drink is? Beer, rum, wine. In any case, those in charge seem to be at ease and seated with canes, while the produce is clearly stacking up on the dock, including what appears to be tobacco coming out of a barrel on the left, and perhaps stored up in the second floor of the storehouse to the left in the background. In any case, the idea was that this was the most inhabited part of Virginia by Europeans. Indigenous peoples didn't really count. They may have lived there, but they weren't considered inhabitants, and surveyors and land speculators like Washington, in fact, went into their lands to lay out tracts on maps and claim rights to the lands of those people. At the same time that Washington was trading and dealing on the American frontier, what was happening on other frontiers at the same time? Well, scholars like Professor Henry Louis Gates have initiated some of the research in this realm, and others who've looked into the maps of the period are coming up with very interesting observations about what was going on the colonial frontiers at the time. With the new technology of digitization, it's now possible for international scholars to revisit, or in many cases, visit for the first time, since these are very rare maps, and usually only available in special collections, but now can be viewed as a whole range of maps to be visited anew for their insights. As with other published sources long ago, when historical maps are retrieved, digitized, and shared publicly, they can reveal a great deal to scholars and to the whole world about comparative colonial history.
Early maps are pretty interesting and crude in a way, but you can see the details from them have European ships showing up and local populations with elephants and various kinds of imaginary beings represented on the early maps, and some cases big structures like this one, the Castle of Mines, Elmina as it was called in the Portuguese maps at the time. Later maps show more and more ships showing up, and the reason they're showing up is that they're exporting manpower at this point across the Atlantic and putting them to work on those depopulated islands in the Caribbean as part of the systematic effort of empire building. European mercantilism was based on the discovery, appropriation, transport, cultivation, and sale of exotic plants, animals, and animal products of one kind or another. This was a purposeful and sustained ecological disruption. This wasn't accidental, this was intentional. The age of discovery was largely an age of ecological discovery and intentional disruption. Europeans and their trading counterparts acted brutally to transform all accessible ecosystems around the world in order to export crops in a plantation system. We're the cultural heirs of this tradition, and we ought to keep this clearly in mind. Ecological disruption based on migration, forced migration in this case, is the basis for the wealth that came out of the plantation economies that spurred Europe's development into the industrial age. From 1492, Europeans observed native usage and looked to the economic value of new and exotic plants like sugar, coffee, pepper, bananas, tobacco, and the like. You can remember them all from elementary school. The plantation agriculture was the basis for the transatlantic system. Some introductions were intentional, but most of them were not. They were accidental. But we're the heirs to the cultural habits of this kind of ecological assault and forced migration, the largest non-voluntary migration in human history. For the most part, Europeans became unwitting agents of empire. They thought they were in charge, but they didn't realize how much of what was happening they were merely observing and taking notes on. They did take notes on them, and in fact, they tried to be purposive in one way or another. But when you look at the slave trade itself, it's pretty staggering, the impact that it was having both in the New World, where populations were being introduced to entirely new environments, and in Africa, where populations were being denuded, exported. And it's for this reason that historians have started to map the slave trade from the initial maps. There's the kind of international online digital map archive that's emerging now which we can build with the computer technology that's available through things like Google Earth. This is an archive for reference, research, and teaching in African and American history. So much of American history depends upon this period that it's absolutely crucial we take a look at some of these things as part of the expanded discussion of immigration policy, if nothing else. You can take a look at these old maps online, and I'd urge you to do so, and take a look in detail at some of the information that's in them, including sort of accounts of what these trading encounters look like. They're pretty extraordinary when you think of it. These are representations, artists' representations. These aren't photographs. But in effect, the trading was taking place on the coast between European merchants and local Africans for such things as ivory and slaves. And this is what, in effect, was transported to the New World for the benefit of these island populations and island plantations that were the basis of the whole thing. Now, in Africa, these things got going on islands as well, and it's very useful to look at the old maps of these islands. You can start to analyze them in detail. Some of the Europeans landed on them and gave great fortifications some dimensions here, and then they'd make maps like these which enable you to see what they were doing in each case. And they provided great detail from the late 1600s through about the late 1700s, just about when America was having its war of independence. And that is worth looking at in detail. You can actually see these kinds of maps as if they're from a balloon. This is way before balloon technology, but they were imagining what it must have looked like above these places, and they interpreted it from the vantage point of a bird's eye view, as it were. They also provided examples of what it looked like on the ground, and that's actually very interesting because they did engravings of what it looked like from inside the fort. This is absolutely staggering. In a sense, you could see, as if you can walk around at the time and see what's involved here. You can even see where that is on a Google map and parachute into looking at it. As it turns out, this is the end of that island of Gorée, and it has a lot to do with the whole history of the slave trade, and it's something that now you can visit by way of Google Earth and Google Maps. In fact, you can take a view that's right from within it. This is staggering in a way because it now makes it possible, this kind of internationally available information on the internet and through Google, it makes it possible to look at these images from over here in America, but in effect we can see what it looked like inside that slave fort, complete with its guns. And you can do a virtual tour, a 360-degree view of what was in that 1686 print by the Europeans talking about the forts on the island of Gorée. This is quite an extraordinary facility now made available through the electronic technology that allows you to, in effect, tour these islands and the mainland nearby as part of what's available on the web. If you looked at it here, that's where the fort existed. We can go back a bit and, in fact, turn this around, and you can see from the angle of the island that this is a current day aerial photograph, in fact taken from space, of what? Well, it turns out that it's an aerial photograph of that 18th century map and 17th century images. If you look at this map in detail, you can actually place it on top in Google Earth place it on top of that island, and begin to see things in great detail. You can swivel it around and turn it upwards like this, parachute in on the 18th century map, and see what was happening in the slave trade. As it turns out, a great deal was happening, and that's what's recorded here in the documentary volumes that go with these maps. But we're just beginning to be able to explore these maps digitally, internationally, by sharing these things online with scholars around the world. There have been distinguished visitors in the more recent moment, too.
Today we boarded a ferry to Gorée Island, which is just off the coast of Senegal. Now, for roughly 300 years, until the mid-1840s, millions of men, women, and children from Africa were kidnapped from their homes and communities and brought to this island to be sold as slaves. Now, on the island, we saw cells where dozens of people were packed together for months on end. We saw the courtyard where they were forced to stand naked while buyers examined them, negotiated a price, and bought them as if they were nothing but property. And we saw what is known as the door of no return, the doorway through which these men and women and children passed on their way across the ocean to a life of slavery, a brutal journey many of us know as the Middle Passage. Now, standing there, I thought about the terror and grief these people must have felt as they took their last steps through that doorway, knowing they would never again see their families or their country. There is no way to undo what happened on Gorée Island and no way to erase the stain of slavery from our nation's past. But there is also no denying the course that history has taken since that time. Since then, we've seen so many brave men and women rise up against slavery and segregation and injustice and inequality of all kinds. People who came through this island could never have imagined how history would unfold. And they certainly could never have imagined that someone like me, a descendant of slaves, would come here and look back through that door of no return. Maybe in the end, that is an argument for hope, even in the face of the most unspeakable horrors. Because time and again, both in America and around the world, we have seen that cruelty and oppression are no match for people of conscience who commit themselves to the cause of freedom.
Now, this was a film put up by Michelle and Barack Obama on the whitehouse.gov, the White House website. It's no longer there. It's been taken down by the current resident of the White House, as you might imagine. And the thing is, we can't erase the history. In fact, the history of the migration is something that will indelibly be imprinted on our minds and on our understanding of our own history. It's absolutely crucial that we begin to refocus upon this in mapping the slave trade and learning about places like Gorée and the mainland areas from which most of the slaves came. We may have come on different ships to the New World, but we're now all in the same boat. This is most apparent in reference to climate change. As you can see, much of Florida will disappear. Much of the Caribbean, that was the source of the wealth of the plantation system, will disappear. And this will lead to a new chapter in the migration history of the Americas. A brand new chapter. It's already leading to it. It's not as if this is something in the distant future. This is something already underway. Skip Gates reminds us, in effect, that although some people want to make America great again, it only became great in the first place because it was the beneficiary of the Atlantic system with an open immigration policy, entirely, in fact, so open that it was forced immigration, the largest non-voluntary migration in human history. We were welcoming people from all different cultures and traditions and making them, in effect, into laborers for the emergence of what became, in some people's estimation, the great American dream. If we're going to try to make America great again, we ought to remember what made it great in the first place.
Commerce and Cartography on Colonial Frontiers, re-examining American and African history through maps, is a crucial next step. Simply put, the digitization of maps of colonial frontiers provides an important new means for understanding comparative colonial history in our post-colonial world. We all need now to learn. We may have come on different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. We are all migrants on a small planet.